With the previous two generations of the Range Rover, there's always been a sportier version called the Range Rover Sport. I thought in this video it would be interesting to see, now that there is a 2022 brand new Range Rover, to see what the Sport version could look like. And I'm going to redesign that based on the changes that we've seen from the past two generations. So I'm going to show you the 2003 Range Rover compared to the 2006 Range Rover Sport, show you what changed there in proportions and in graphics, and also the 2013 Range Rover and the Range Rover Sport that was based off of that version, and also show you there what changed in proportions, graphics, and then see if we can take those clues and ideas and apply that onto the 2022 Range Rover and create our own Range Rover Sport. But before we do that, let's have a look at what the new Land Rover Range Rover is here. So the new Range Rover here is all about removing things instead of adding more stuff to it, and that is really important when you talk about the design here. You can definitely tell that that was the approach and philosophy that they went with. So it comes in three different configurations: a standard wheelbase first edition, an extended wheelbase SV with a 4-seat interior, and a 7-seater option now as well. So what about the engine choices here? Well, you still have the 3-liter turbocharged inline-six with 48-volt hybrid assistance in the base SC. This puts out 395 horsepower and 406 pound-feet of torque. However, Range Rover did not ditch the V8 for the 2022 model year, which is great. You can still have it with a brand new 4.4 liter twin turbo V8 making 523 horsepower and 553 pound-feet of torque. This launches the Range Rover from 0 to 60 in just 4.4 seconds, which is pretty crazy when you think about the size of this thing. There will also be a plug-in hybrid 6-cylinder for the 2023 model year, and this makes 434 horsepower and 516 pound-feet of torque with a projected EV range of only 62 miles from its 38.2 kilowatt-hour battery. All-wheel drive is, of course, this is a Range Rover, so all-wheel drive is of course standard on all new Range Rovers. However, it can be driven now as rear-wheel drive only by disconnecting the front axle completely, and this is still very much a great off-roader with a ground clearance of an impressive 11.6 inches, with the air suspension offering an additional maximum rise of 5.7 inches. You have 6 off-road driving modes available in the Range Rover, and it can plow through 3 feet of water. You can order your 2022 Range Rover right now, and prices start at $105,350 for the SE, all the way up to $164,850 for the long wheelbase version. Now, what I want to talk about is the Range Rover Sport. That's the one we're going to focus on. They still haven't released a Range Rover Sport of the 2022 model. It's still too early for that. So what we're going to do is go back in history here and have a look at the regular Range Rover and the Range Rover Sport, compare the two, and I want to focus on the rear design and the proportions of these SUVs. Compare it to the standard one up here. This is of course the first Range Rover that got a Sport version added to it. So you have the 2003 Range Rover down here, and then in 2006 we got this first ever Range Rover Sport down here. So what exactly happened here? Let's look at the graphics. From what we can see here, the Range Rover, the regular one, is very strict in its proportions. You can see that it's very tight, and it doesn't have any playroom from the original Range Rover design. It doesn't really have any room to be any sportier with a sloping roofline. It's function over a more stylized approach for the regular Range Rover. But with the Range Rover Sport, you can see that this pillar right here, what would this is A, B, C, and D pillar. So let's have a look at the D pillar right here. You can see that it has clearly a lot more sloping line to it than we have on the regular Range Rover right here, and it just feels more nimble and lower to the ground. You also have this relation between if we take a look at the overall height here of the Range Rover from 2003 right here, we put a line in the middle where the body meets the window line. You can see that it's almost 50-50 divided here. We do have a little bit more of a body mass than we have greenhouse, but you still have a very tall looking greenhouse. Compare that to the Range Rover Sport here. You can see that this part shrinks a little bit. The greenhouse, it looks like the roofline sits a little lower, and that's only natural since it is a sportier version of the Range Rover. That means that we need to have a lower roofline, and also the body itself, the SUV itself, it sits lower to the ground. One detail that I've always loved about this first generation 2006 Range Rover Sport are these details that we have right here at the bottom. So I think these looks really cool, and it just adds some beefiness to this design. And the rear end of these, both of these, I think these looks very modern still today, and that has to do with just Range Rover and Land Rover overall. They're in general, they're super tight design DNA and design language. They know what they're doing, and they've been doing the same kind of styling since the 70s. And this is what you get. You can take a model from 20 years ago, just if we just applied some new graphics and LEDs, lighting design details to these two cars, it would look like it could definitely be a 2022 Range Rover or Land Rover, these two designs. The thing that gives it away is it's always going to be the lighting, usually when it comes to these kind of 20 years back models. If we apply some modern lighting to this, it could definitely be a modern design. And I still think the Range Rover Sport from 2006 down here, it looks really cool. It just looks like a sporty SUV. It looks like a beast of a machine. And I also love the bumpers, the rear bumpers, where we're gonna talk about more when we do the redesign. That's gonna be one part that I actually redesign on the Range Rover, the new one, to add this bumper to house and hold the bottom part of the rear graphics of the Range Rover. Because look at this, I love this bumper here, how it goes up right here, this angle, it's typical Range Rover. And then we have a clear bumper that is super functional. It doesn't really have a lot of styling to it, but it's very bulky, and that's exactly what I want to have at the bottom of the base of the Range Rover rear end. So this is the 2003 model year Range Rover up here, and the 2006 Range Rover Sport down at the bottom. Now let's jump forward 10 years, a decade or so, to 2013. Let's have a look at the Range Rover there, and then compare that to what happened to the Range Rover Sport, and then compare that version to these 2003 models. So here we have the 2013 Range Rover up here, and you can see that now we have a similar styling to what we have right here, although the graphics have been updated for a more modern look, obviously. I think this is a good, really good looking design, both the regular Range Rover and the Range Rover Sport. But let's have a look at what we have here. We still have non-negotiable design proportions for the regular Range Rover right here. Those key lines, we do now have a little bit better split here. Better, I say better because it looks sportier than when we have a little bit of a more like 40% up here and 60 right here when we have split body compared to the greenhouse. It's a little bit different from what we have in 2003, where it's more like, as I said, 45-55. But here we have more of a 40-60 split, which I think looks a lot better. And also we still have this send-off in the rear by the rear bumper right here. And now we also have a bit of a slope on the regular Range Rover even. This is not even the Sport. This looks like a modernized version of the old Range Rover Sport, if that makes sense. And it looks really good. But when we now look at the Range Rover Sport down here, the second generation, it got even more sportier. And we can now see, if we have a look at the greenhouse here specifically, just how much shorter it is in the rear end compared to the regular Range Rover. So this part right here, the D-pillar, it still has a bit of a slope, not too much, but then we have more of a slope down here. And you can see now that the greenhouse definitely goes back here. It dips a lot more than we have on the Range Rover up here. Of course, it gives it a sportier look. That's the whole point of having a Range Rover Sport. Compare it to the Range Rover, it needs to have a more of a sporty appearance. And one way to do that is to slope the rear end and have it be more tight in the rear, and also have the graphics be more horizontal instead of vertical, which you can see here. Here we have a vertical taillight, which builds up the graphical height of the rear end. And here they're more slammed and more squished out to the sides, which compresses the rear end visually as well. And on top of that, we now have a diffuser that sticks further up, which also adds even more to compressing the rear end of the Range Rover Sport compared to the regular Range Rover up here. We also have a little bit of a spoiler up here. What I want to focus on is the greenhouse. So let's have a look at the height of the greenhouse. You can see that it gets narrower and narrower, and then we have the same kind of shoulder line that we have on the regular Range Rover, and the send-off down here as well. Not as much of a defined bumper as you can see compared to the Range Rover up here, and I really like this design of Range Rovers. I prefer to have a solid bumper, as I said, and that is just to give the rear end some sort of a base to rest on, a solid base that is the bumper that kind of holds the rear graphics up, if that makes sense. So now, if we take those changes from the Range Rover to the Range Rover Sport and apply it onto this is of course the new 2022 Range Rover. What if we want to make a sport version out of this? So if we have a look at what we analyze here from these two versions, the 2003 and 13, what can be applied to this? Well, in my opinion, what I'm gonna do here now in the redesign is to, of course, we want to have this more to be a slopier line, remove a couple of inches off the roof line, especially in the rear end, so we have more of a dynamic line going there. We don't want to change the shoulder line. The shoulder line is super important to keep intact. It's one of these non-negotiables for a Range Rover to have this be straight and clean, and same goes, I would say, for this line right here. We still have a send-off, as you can see right here. This angles up, and I really like that. It gives it a sportier send-off and more of a drop design, and you can see that the further back we go of the design right here, the further back in this direction we go, the narrower the lines are right here, and I really like that. But if we're going to make a sport version, I think that needs to be emphasized even more. And on top of that, as I said, I prefer to have a proper bumper on this. I know that's not going to happen with the Range Rover Sport, because if they don't put a regular bumper on the Range Rover, the regular one, they're definitely not going to do it on the upcoming Range Rover Sport. But in my opinion, I just want to redesign that and add a base for the graphics to rest on. So what about the graphic details here? You can see that this is the lighting here for the new Range Rover. So if we think about what they did here for this generation with the taillights, they squished it and made it more horizontal. So how can we do that here? Well, I would say we kind of have to maybe take this part and move it up to this point, so we get something like this, and then we just delete this part, so we kind of compresses it that way. I'm not really sure how this redesign is going to turn out, but the only way to figure that out is to get started and get going with the design. So let's do that right now, and let's see how this is going to turn out. So I talked about this in my other video of the Range Rover on my second YouTube channel called Bembly. You can go and subscribe to that if you haven't done that yet. We discussed and analyzed designs, and on this channel I actually do some redesigns to them. That's the difference between the two channels. So I said in that video that this is something that we've been talking about for almost a year now. More manufacturers are starting to realize that just by adding more things to the designs, you're actually diluting your brand identity, and you're making it harder to separate yourself from other brands. And that's the problem that's been happening in the car design industry, or the automotive industry in general, for I would say the past decade or so. Just adding more lines is not gonna help you create a stronger brand identity for your brand. But the cool thing about Land Rover in general is that they stuck with their design identity and their design philosophy all the way almost for over 50 years now, since the 70s, to keep the same proportions. And they're really just upgrading or redesigning the small details, such as the graphics and the taillights, headlights, and so on. But the overall proportions, if you put the silhouette of the 2022 model Range Rover and apply that onto, let's say, a 1990s or even the first two-door Range Rover back in the day, you will still see a very clear resemblance between the two. The only thing that changes, as I said, are the graphic details of the car, of the SUV here, and I think that's really important. I think more brands should do that, and I'm really glad that they decided to go with the approach here for the new Range Rover to subtract even more, even though the previous generation Range Rover from 2013 up until this year, it's still a very restrained design, but this is even more so. They just stripped it away even more. And I also said in that video that since it's so stripped down, it doesn't really have any creases or anything in the body lines. This looks like it's already ready to be an EV, and I think that's gonna happen within the lifetime of this generation Range Rover, because as you know, a Range Rover doesn't come around very often. It's once in a decade or so that a new Range Rover comes out, and if we go a decade in the future from now, we definitely need to have some sort of electrified Range Rover. And I think that's gonna happen with this generation. I think the design is already looking like an EV basically, but at the same time, I'm really glad that they decided to put a brand new 4.4 liter twin turbo V8 in the new 2022 to keep the V8 alive here, and that has a massive 523 horsepower and 553 pound-feet of torque, which is a beast of a V8. It's not just a hybrid low-powered V8 where you have just the V8 to have a V8 in there, and then you have some sort of hybrid technology that puts out half of the power, which could be, of course, a very good solution to keeping V8s alive. By the way, if we had some solutions like that to bring down the low-end torque with the electric power, and then you have the V8 power kicking out at the higher RPMs. But for the design here, I really don't know what to expect. It's a short redesign. I just wanted to have some fun and see what we can do based on the previous generation Range Rover Sports, and I had a lot of fun doing this. I can't wait to see the real thing. I think it's going to be a beautiful beauty of a machine when they actually put out the official Range Rover Sport. Because if the Range Rover looks this good with these proportions, imagine adding even sportier proportions to this. It can't be anything else but a really good looking SUV.